Hey there, welcome back to the show, MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and today is a Q&A episode. So today we're going to dive into a few different topics. The first one is going to be on training to failure. The second one is on how to match yourself up with a coach. The next question is related to hormonal effects for women on keto or keto and carnivore diets. And then the last question is related to continuous glucose monitors. So those are the topics we're going to dive into. I'll read out the specific questions when we get there. Before we do, I do want to give a shout out to our sponsor for the month of January, Active Stacks. And I'm excited to announce that today we are doing a giveaway for Active Stacks. So today's giveaway will be 3 winners will each receive a bottle of both the chocolate flavor and the vanilla flavor of the Active Stacks protein powder. If you don't know what Active Stacks is, it's a protein powder company and they make non-GMO beef protein, which is a really great alternative for someone who might be sensitive to whey protein or maybe other protein powders. You just don't like the taste of them or the flavor. Some plant protein powders tend to have some grittiness to them. So if you're sensitive to that or you just don't like it, this is a great alternative. And they make vanilla and chocolate flavors. I've mentioned this before, but I use the Active Stacks chocolate protein powder very often to make protein ice cream. It literally tastes like a Frosty from Wendy's. It's awesome. So in order to enter this giveaway, again, it's going to be 3 winners each receive a bottle of both the Active Stacks chocolate flavor and the vanilla flavor. So in order to enter, you just have to make sure that you're subscribed to this podcast, MetFlex and Chill, wherever you listen to podcasts. That's the first thing. The second thing is leave a rating and a review mentioning something you learned from this episode today. So if you're listening to this on iTunes, you can just leave a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating, and then a short review just mentioning something you took away from this episode so that I know this is the episode or this is the giveaway that you're entering. And if you've already left a rating and a review on iTunes, they actually don't let you do it twice for the same show. So you can also enter if you've already left a rating and review, you can enter by just taking a screenshot of this episode as you're listening to it, post it on your Instagram story, and then tag me at rachelgregory.cns, and you'll be entered for a chance to win. So again, 3 winners will each receive a bottle of chocolate and vanilla Active Stacks protein. And if you want to check out Active Stacks in the meantime, you can actually go to activestacks.com/discount/chill. And you'll be able to get 10% off your order, or you can just go to activestacks.com and use the discount code CHILL for 10% off, and I will link that in the show notes. Okay, the first question today comes from one of my personal one-on-one clients. Shout out to Eric. He said, I've been reading a book where the author is a big advocate of doing exercises to failure, or he doesn't think it's worth doing. I know we typically don't go to failure and work with the RIR scale, but can you explain this reasoning further? So in general, I don't agree with the statement, that doing exercise to failure is necessary or it's not worth doing. But it does come back to context and then also what types of exercises you're actually doing and within what context. So I'm going to dive into that in a second. But before we do that, let's just quickly define what failure actually means when it comes to training. So failure usually has 2 common meanings, form failure and then also mechanical failure. Those are the 2 different quote unquote types of failure when we're talking about training. So first is, like I said, the form failure. That's basically where there's a breakdown in form during a rep, and maybe you can perform that rep, but you can perform that complete rep, but your form just breaks down completely. So yes, you get through the rep, but you just have crappy form, and you probably should have stopped before that rep, basically. The second meaning of failure is mechanical failure. So that's where the weight can no longer be physically moved. So if you're doing, for example, a back squat and you get down and you can't get back up, so you have to either drop the weight or you have to have someone help you bring the weight back up, that would be mechanical failure. So in general, you don't really, in my opinion, you don't really want to be performing the big like multi-joint compound lifts to mechanical failure. So those would be, like I said, back squats, things like really any squat variation that's using like a barbell, for example, and deadlifts, overhead presses, things like that, because the risk of injury when form breaks down with those compound movements is usually really high, especially for like the average person who's just going to the gym, training, trying to build muscle, get stronger. So it's probably not a good idea to take those movements to mechanical failure. And even performing these lifts to form failure on a regular basis is also probably not that great of an idea, for the same reasons, and also because systematic fatigue can be really high if you're training these movements to failure. So you can generate a lot of systematic or overall body fatigue, which can limit your ability to perform well in the rest of your session or in subsequent sessions if you're doing that with these compound movements, right? So if we're talking on the kind of opposite side, we're talking about like isolation or accessory movements, it's probably safer, right, to train an isolation exercise or an accessory movement to failure. These would be things like bicep curls, tricep extensions, leg extensions or curls, lateral raises, or even machine or cable compound movements like rows and pull downs. All of those are going to be safer to perform to failure because when we're talking about isolation movements, they're smaller muscle groups. So like if you're doing a lateral raise, if you're doing lateral raises for your delts, like you can, go to failure. And if you hit failure, you can just drop the dumbbells. Or if you're using like a cable machine or another machine and you have some support with that, then going to failure on those is going to be obviously safer than going to failure with big compound lifts. So that's just something to think about. But let's break down the pros and cons of going to failure and where it would be maybe smart and where it would not be smart. Because again, it all comes back to context, depending on what you're doing, what your goals are, and all of that. So a few of the main issues with training to failure, I would say the biggest issue is that it prolongs recovery time, right? I talked about this just a minute ago. If you train to failure too frequently, you can actually decrease the amount of volume that you can do overall, and it can compromise your next training session, right? So if you go, for example, if you go really, really hard in the gym on Monday and you train every single movement to failure, you're probably not going to feel so great the rest of the week, or at least for the next few days. And so that's going to cause those subsequent training sessions to not be as great as they could be, right? And so if we're talking about, overall volume and intensity for the entire week, that's probably going to be lower than if you didn't train to failure, if you trained using submaximal loads. And this is something that I think, people tend to not always think about. It's like, what's the overall long-term training goal, right? Not just what's my training goal today, but how am I going to feel the rest of the week or even next week? And obviously the goal if your goal is to build muscle or even strength, like you want to be able to perform optimally throughout, your entire training cycle. And so if you go really, really hard today, then you're probably going to be super sore tomorrow or the next day, and you're going to generate a lot of fatigue, and you're just not going to be performing as well, versus if you perform today using submaximal loads and you went close to failure but maybe didn't hit failure, then you would probably be better equipped to go into your training sessions the rest of the week and feel a little bit fresher. So that's the biggest thing. It's just a recovery issue. If you're always training to failure, you can generate tons of fatigue and not have enough recovery time between workouts. Another thing, which I mentioned, is unnecessary increased stress on your nervous system and your joints. So you can, like I said, create a lot of systematic fatigue, especially if you're training the big compound movements to failure every single time. You're just going to generate so much stress on your system and even your joints, and that's just not going to be advantageous for the long term. And then also there's a psychological component to it as well. Like if you go into the gym and you try to train to failure every single day that you go to the gym, and every single rep or every single set and exercise that you're doing, you're going to take a psychological hit, because that's just a lot. So those would be like the biggest issues with training to failure. And then on the flip side, times when training to failure could be useful or necessary. I'll give you a few different scenarios here. So the first one would be if you are, training for a specific, like a meet or like a powerlifting competition or something like that, and you're trying to test your 1 rep max, or in general, if you just want to test your 1 rep max on a specific lift, obviously you need to train to failure to do that because you're testing that 1 rep max. Another reasoning would be, or another useful useful time to train to failure would be, like I mentioned, during those isolation or accessory movements. So, specifically if you're using different training techniques like drop sets or cluster sets to increase stimulation and muscle fiber activation, then yes, that would make sense to take those movements to failure. But again, this comes in context with your overall training plan as well. So that would be another time. And another time could be, or another reason or, time that it would be useful to train to failure would be if you're actually trying to gauge your RIR scale. So I'm going to talk about what this is in a second, what an RIR scale is, but sometimes some people struggle with gauging what their RIR scale is. So, or where they're at on that, and this will make more sense when I explain it. But sometimes you need to train to failure to actually find your 0 RIR or 0 reps left in the tank. So typically, you don't want to train to failure on everything, but you do need to get close to failure in order to stimulate growth. So that's where this RIR scale comes into play. You can also, most people know it as I feel like it's becoming more popular, the RIR scale, but most people will know this as the RPE scale. So if you've never heard of the RIR scale, you've probably heard of the RPE scale, and that stands for rate of perceived exertion. So it's basically RIR scale is basically the same concept, just in reverse. So the RPE scale rates how hard something feels on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being basically no effort and then 10 being max effort. And then the RIR scale, which is known as the reps in reserve scale, gauges how many reps you basically have, quote unquote, left in the tank at the end of a set. So for example, if you ended a set with 2 reps in reserve, that would be equivalent to, say, an 8 on the RPE scale. If you ended a set with 4 reps in reserve, that would be considered a 6 on the RPE scale, and so on and so forth. So they're the same concept, just in reverse. And I typically recommend using the RIR scale when we're talking about lifting weights and things like that, because I feel like for me personally and for a lot of the clients I work with, it's just a better way to gauge lifts versus like the RPE scale usually is, at least for me, I've seen it used more so in like endurance type activities. But overall, they're pretty much the same. So what we know is that based on the research, we know that the best results will come training primarily at an RPE of 7 to 9, or what would be a 1 to 3 reps in reserve. So this generally provides adequate intensity for progress without creating too much stress to recover from, right? Which is really where the gold's at, for sure. So I talk about this, all the time, but progress towards building muscle and getting stronger comes down to progressively overloading movements over time. You must be doing that. You must be doing a little bit more really each week that you go into the gym to train whatever movement you're doing or whatever exercise you're doing. And the RIR scale is a tool we use to make sure you're using the appropriate amount of effort to keep progressing throughout your program without having to use percentages of 1 rep maxes or doing 1 rep max testing. Because honestly, most people don't need to be doing 1 rep max 1 rep max testing, because 1, it's just unnecessary, and 2, it can actually increase risk of injury for most people. And like I said, just not really necessary. So this is why I personally recommend using RIR scale. And then on top of that, we also obviously live in the real world. We have day-to-day fluctuations in how we're feeling, our energy levels, things like that. So using scales like the RIR and the RPE can help with actually auto-regulating your training to help you adjust day-to-day depending on different life stressors, things like that. So using RIR makes your training a lot more individualized to how you're feeling on a daily basis. So for example, if you underslept, or you're under-recovered, or you're just under a lot of life stress in general, training will probably feel a lot harder during that time. So rather than, pushing through that and trying to hit a specific percentage, specific number, RIR actually naturally kind of progresses and regresses intensity depending on how you're feeling that day that you're going into training. And obviously, some days you'll have to push through training, depending on what's going on, depending on what your goals are. But this still, in my personal opinion, RIR helps to still help you regulate and auto-regulate things on an, overall basis. So it's also important because if you don't have someone judging your appropriate intensity for you, as you're training. So if you're not working with a trainer, in person, RIR and RP skills help, again, auto-regulate your training and help you to optimize your results because they help you kind of quantify what you're doing and put that on a scale versus saying, oh yeah, that rep felt kind of hard and maybe I, stimulated a little muscle growth there versus actually having a specific scale and a specific gauge of what you're doing, right? That's super important. So gauging intensity in your training is important because also we have to think about something called effective reps, okay? So again, I'm just going to repeat what the RIR scale is before I get into effective reps. But to gauge reps in reserve, ask yourself at the end of a set, how many more reps could I have squeezed out if I absolutely had to with good form and adequate range of motion? That's kind of the question that I always tell my clients to think of as they're performing their reps. That's what I ask myself. So again, I'll repeat that. How many reps could I have squeezed out if I absolutely had to with good form and adequate range of motion? Your answer is your reps in reserve or your RIR, or how many reps you feel you had left before failure, okay? So aside from autoregulation and moving away from one rep max testing, utilizing the RIR scale or reps in reserve properly can actually ensure your training is providing an effective stimulus for growth. So the closer you take a set to failure, the more muscle fibers you're going to recruit and fatigue. Right? That makes sense. And it's thought that the last few reps of a set are by far the ones you get the most out of. And the reason for this is because they basically do the most to disrupt homeostasis and really spark that new muscle growth, right? So this concept is known as what I mentioned as effective reps. Basically, the closer you take a set to failure, the more muscle fibers it recruits and fatigues. Thus, the closer a set is to failure, the more effective it is at stimulating muscle growth because it recruits and works more muscle fibers, right? So, like I mentioned earlier, we know that if we push the intensity too far, so if you're doing lots of sets to failure, you're in that 0 RIR or that 10 RPE range, you're going to be creating too much stress to recover from overall in general. So, and we also know that if your RIR is too high, probably, 5+ or 4+ reps in reserve, you're not going to actually get much out of the work that you're putting in because you're not going to be stimulating and recruiting the appropriate amount of muscle and muscle fibers to be able to grow. So that's something to think about. And this is why, again, I love using RIR with all of my one-on-one clients. And then also a side note here, if you are training from home right now, which not most of us, but a lot of us have had to do over the course of the last, year actually. But if you're training from home and you have a limited amount of equipment, RIR is actually going to be your best friend for making gains, week to week, right? Because we generally know that training in the 5 to 30 rep range has the most potential for muscle growth. We know this from multiple studies that have been done. But if you're at home with, obviously limited equipment, as long as you hit the effective rep zone, which I just mentioned, the actual number of reps really doesn't make that much of a difference. You just need to push it to the point where you only have a few reps left in the tank, because then you'll be stimulating adequate muscle fiber recruitment, right? And adequate fatigue to actually grow and build muscle. So basically, as long as you can find a way to train all of your movements to about 3 reps in reserve or less in the, like I said, 5 to 30 rep range, you can really achieve great results even at home, regardless of the equipment that you have available, as long as you're kind of getting within that effective reps range. So hopefully that makes up. Wow, I cannot talk. Hopefully that makes sense. And then just to wrap up this question and kind of do a quick review, because I know I just mumbled on for probably 20 minutes. I don't even know how long. But basically, training to failure all the time is, like I said, probably not the best idea, but training close to failure will produce the best results. So it takes practice to gauge this, and it takes practice to actually use the RIR scale. But in order to build muscle and actually change your physique over time, you must learn how to manage fatigue properly. So it does, it took me a while to kind of, come to terms with this and figure this out, and not always, because I have a very type A personality. Like, I just, every day I want to, go as hard as I can, but I've realized that that's not the best way to go about things, especially if I'm looking at the long term and really want to change, my physique over the long term and actually build substantial amounts of muscle, right? So in the acute setting, of a single training session, taking an exercise to failure will stimulate more muscle growth than, say, stopping 2 reps shy of failure or 2 reps left in the tank. But if you're constantly training to failure, your fatigue's going to get too high and you're just going to stop progressing. So in general, it's probably smart to spend, I would say, the majority of your time training around that 1 to 3 RIR, while also keeping in mind the differences in overall fatigue and recovery with the exercises that you're performing, right? So the differences in training a compound movement to failure versus an isolation movement to failure. So, it's probably not ideal to take your squat or deadlift to failure every week, or if at all, but doing, say, bicep curls or lateral raises to failure will have a lot less of an impact on overall fatigue. So I wouldn't be too worried about those. And if you are, working with someone who's programming for you, or if you're programming for yourself or whatever it may be, like, that should be planned into your program. So you should be following a structured plan progression with smart RIR targets for these different movements, because that's going to be important for actually seeing results, over time, and following, like I always say, a smart, well-structured training program. And if you have no idea how to do this, or if you have no idea how to structure a program, obviously I recommend hiring someone to help you with that. If you're interested in working with me, you could always go to my website, metflexlife.com/apply, and you can apply for one-on-one coaching. I help you with your nutrition and also training. I do personalized training programs, all personalized nutrition, all of that for one-on-one clients. So if you're interested in that, definitely go to metflexlife.com/apply. But in general, it's just smart to kind of understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. And obviously, when it comes to training to failure, there's pros and cons there. I would say, just from my experience, that there's generally more cons of training to failure than there are pros. But you have to understand that you need to actually train close to failure to actually get results. So it's a little bit confusing, but hopefully I broke it down in a way that was a little bit easier to understand using that RIR scale and that effective reps, not theory, but yeah, I guess you can call it the effective reps theory. So anyway, that's all I got for that question. Okay, the next question, tips on how to match yourself up with a coach. Okay, so, if you're looking to hire a coach for, whatever it may be, I think the biggest thing is to first think about, what is your primary goal, right? Like, why are you primarily hiring this coach? Because everybody has different goals, different coaches have different specializations. So first, just figure out what that primary goal is. So whether it's, fat loss, building muscle, training for something specific, do you have like gut health or hormonal issues that you're trying to troubleshoot? So different coaches have different specializations and things that they specialize in. So that would be the first thing. Just figure out what's your primary goal, and then that will help you to kind of first start to sift through the different coaches that are out there, and look for, those different areas of focus. The second thing I would say is, kind of going off of the first thing, is what areas does the coach specialize in, right? Because that's going to be important for what, you're looking for. And then also kind of to piggyback with this is, what are their credentials, right? Because, what did they go to school for? Do they have certain certifications? And not that, more certifications are better, but, a good coach and someone who's been doing this for a while should have, some credentials to show for the education that they've gone through, the continuing education that they continue to go through, and all of that. So I would say credentials are important as well. But again, kind of thinking about what that coach specializes in. So for example, for my typical clients, they are women who are looking for fat loss, body recomposition, building muscle, or kind of a combination of all of those. So that would be like the typical goal of a client who comes to me with some background in the sense of most of my clients have either tried a keto or low carb diet in the past, and they want to work on becoming more metabolically flexible. That's what I definitely specialize in. But then there's also some who are thriving with a low carb lifestyle, but they want to optimize some other areas. And there's also some of my clients who have never tried keto before and they don't actually have any interest in it, but they've come through other people who may have tried keto and they've gotten good results, or may have, gone through keto and found me through keto and they got really good results, or they enjoyed coaching, so they referred someone else who might not have tried keto and they're just looking for fat loss or body recomposition or building muscle. So I know that was kind of a roundabout way of explaining, the specific clients that I work with, but really, it's mostly those who are interested in fat loss, body recomposition, building muscle, and then, becoming more metabolically flexible overall as well. So, and then also mostly women, but I do actually have some male clients. The person who asked this question, the first question in this episode, is actually a male client, but I mostly work with women. So in general, like I said, my specialization is geared towards body composition changes, and then also, of course, addressing like all the factors that play into that as well. So I talk about this all the time. It doesn't just come down to nutrition and training. It also comes down to mindset practices, stress management, habit building, all of that. So I take a very kind of overall approach when I'm working with clients. It's not just, hey, here's a nutrition plan, or hey, here's a training plan, go follow that. It's okay, let's dive into all these different areas to make sure that we're optimizing as much as we can, and we work on doing that over the course of, the months that we're working together, right? So I would say, just understand what the coach specializes in and make sure that that kind of lines up for what you're looking for. The next tip I would give for finding a coach that works for you would be, what's their personality, right? Do you vibe with their personality? Because, you could see a coach that puts out great content and you enjoy it and, you're learning from them, but then you start to, talk to them or listen to podcasts, and you're just not vibing with them and you are not vibing with their personality, then that's probably not a major, that's probably not the best fit in my opinion. Like I would want to, I don't know if this, I guess for me, if I'm looking for a coach or for my coach, I would want to look up to them, right? And learn from them. So that's something that I would pay attention to. What's their personality? Do you vibe with it? Do they kind of have or exemplify things that you want to bring into your own life? Obviously be kind of like not like a mentor, but have that mentor mentality. That even makes sense. But you want to find a coach that you could vibe with. That's basically the kind of what I'm trying to say. So the next thing would be, do they often, talk about things that you struggle with personally, right? Or are there areas that you want to learn more about that they tend to bring up, in their content? So that's important too, right? Because obviously if they're talking about things that you want to learn more about, then you're probably interested in that. And so that might be a good fit for sure. And then kind of what to look for in a good coach. This is going to kind of goes with what I just mentioned about content. So I would say what to look for in a good coach. The first thing, in my opinion, would be, are they providing some type of education, for you, whether that's on social media or their website? Are they putting out free education or content on a consistent basis that that you're learning from, right? Not just random stuff, or they're not just putting out transformations of all their clients, but they're actually explaining to you, different educational content and things that you're actually learning from outside of, just coaching from them, right? Or coaching with them, right? So that's a big thing. It's just, are they providing valuable content, and do they actually care about it, right? Do they actually care about the content they're putting out, the education they're giving? Can you tell that they are passionate about what they're doing? Because that is going to directly translate into if they actually care about you, right? When they're working with you. I think that's kind of a given, right? So, wow, my voice just cracked, sorry. So yeah, I would say, do they actually put out educational content? Do they care about what they're doing on a daily basis? Like, can you tell that? Usually you can tell. And then does it seem like they know what they're talking about, and actually have experience with coaching? That's another thing. Like, what's their experience level? Because you want to have a coach that has some experience, right? So those would be kind of like the top things that I would think about when you're looking for a coach, or what to look for in a coach. Those would be the things that I personally would look for. And then another thing is to think about the investment. So you probably want to expect that a good coach, one that has experience, one that knows what they're talking about and can get you the results that you're looking for and can educate you along the way, you're probably going to expect them to charge a price that you might not be super comfortable with, right? Because this is an investment. Coaching, one-on-one coaching, it's an investment for you. And it's something that you have to think about, and you have to think about as just that, an investment. And that's how I think about my, paying my coach every single month. It's an investment in my personal health, my personal growth. And yeah, so that's what I would say with that. Just make sure that you are not expecting to, find a coach who only charges like the bare minimum and expect to have, great customer service and great feedback and get the results that you want, because, a good coach probably has been in the game for a while. This is probably their main business, right? Well, I wouldn't say maybe. I mean, there's some coaches that have other, they can do coaching on the side or maybe. So maybe I wouldn't say that, but definitely just be ready for the investment is what I would say with that. So again, if you are interested in coaching with me, or you feel like you vibe well with me and I talk about things that you're interested in, you can always go to my website, metflexlife.com/apply, and you can apply for one-on-one coaching. I have all the information up there for what coaching involves and how to get started. All right, the next question, what are some hormonal effects for women on keto or keto carnivore diets? Okay, so there are kind of a lot of different, I guess you could say, avenues to go down with this topic. And I've actually recorded a few podcast interviews in the past with experts who specialize in hormones, specialize in keto specifically, specialize in carnivore specifically. So I'm going to, rather than, go down different rabbit holes with this, I'm going to point you to those episodes, because I think you're going to get a lot of information out of those from the experts that I did interview. So those episodes, I actually have a list here. Episode 6, Women's Health and Related Keto Issues Specific to Women with Dr. Jaime Seeman. Episode 9, Stress and Fat Loss, Hormone Balance and Carb Cycling with Allie Miller. Episode 48, Hormones, Birth Control, Carb-Ups, Sleep Hygiene, Resistance Training, and more with, again, Dr. Jaime Seeman. And then lastly, episode 61, All Things Carnivore with Dr. Paul Saladino. So all of those episodes dive into hormones, obviously carnivore, keto, all that jazz. So I'm going to link all of those in the show notes. So you can, go back and listen to those. I think you'll find really, really great topics in there, lots of information. And hopefully that will help answer this question. Because again, it's kind of I can go in so many different routes with this question, because it is pretty generalized, and there's so many different caveats to it. So hopefully that helps. Check out those episodes. I'll link them in the show notes. All right, last question today. Why are continuous glucose monitors so expensive? Okay, this is a good question, actually. So first, what is a continuous glucose monitor if you're not sure? So they're also referred to as, you probably heard people talk about CGM. So that's just obviously the acronym for glucose or continuous glucose monitors. And it's just a small device that you put on the back of your arm, so like over your triceps, and it measures your glucose values throughout the day and night. So on a continuous 24/7 basis. So continuous glucose monitors can be actually really useful to help you kind of analyze how your body is responding to lots of different things. So different foods, different combinations of foods, exercise, stress, sleep, all of these things in real time, because it's showing kind of what your blood sugar is doing in your response to these different factors, right? So you can do a lot of experiments with CGMs, which I love because I love experiments. And I've had a few on in the past. I haven't put one on recently, but I'm thinking of getting one in the coming months just to do another experiment to see where I'm at. But basically you can experiment with different eating windows, workout regimens, macronutrient balance, things like that, to kind of see how your blood sugar responds to those different things. So the question was, why are they so expensive? So really, continuous glucose monitor is actually kind of like a new phenomenon for the average person, because I believe that it was only used or they're only popular for type 1 diabetics, and you actually needed a prescription to get a continuous glucose monitor. Like you had to be a type 1 diabetic or have type 2 diabetes and be prescribed by your doctor to have a continuous glucose monitor. And they're also like just in general, the technology has been evolving over the past, I would say probably 5 years, when this has become more popular for like the average person. So I think that's why they're still pretty expensive, because again, the technology is evolving and it's still kind of a newer thing for like your average person who might not have, diabetes. So I think that's why. And then, just with the technology evolving, people are also starting to see the value in monitoring like their overall metabolic health and blood sugar levels. So that's something that's, a little bit newer as well. So, I think as they become more popular and as the technology continues to evolve, the price will start to drop. I just think it's going to take a little bit of time. And also you have kind of the supply and demand side of things, right? So if it's not in huge demand, then there's going to be a lower supply, which is just going to make it more expensive. So as it becomes more kind of mainstream, which I think it is, and even the last year, I think it's become a lot more popular than it was, than it was in previous years. It should start to, the price should start to come down, but it's not, I personally don't think it's like super, super expensive, especially if you get one through a company that is specifically has like an app related to it where you can use that for tracking data and things like that. So I actually recorded an episode with Collier from the Nutrisense company. So if you want to check out episode 35, it's titled The Power of Monitoring Glucose Levels. I will link that in the show notes. And then I've the device and the company that I personally used has been Nutrisense. I've also heard of some other companies that have come out recently. Levels Health has come out. But with Nutrisense, that's the one I've used. And if you want to try out, if you want to check them out, you can actually use the code Rachel, just RACHEL, for $30 off. This is a code they gave me when I recorded this episode with them a while back. So I believe it's still active. Hopefully I'll have to double check that, but it should be still active. So if you want to get a glucose or continuous glucose monitor, kind of test it out with the Nutrisense app, you can go to nutrisense.io and use the code Rachel for $30 off. So I will link that in the show notes along with episode 35, so you can actually learn more about continuous glucose monitoring and all the specifics and details behind that. So yeah, that's my take on that. All right, thanks for listening to that episode. I hope I answered your questions. Make sure that you enter the giveaway for today's episode, featured by ActiveStacks, who is a sponsor for this month. Again, 3 winners will each receive a tub of their vanilla protein powder and a tub of their chocolate protein powder. So to enter, just subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. If you've already done that, you can snap a screenshot of this episode and share it on your Instagram story and tag me at rachelgregory.cns. And you'll be entered to the giveaway, or entered to win the giveaway prizes. And as always, if you're enjoying this podcast in general, please make sure to share it out to anybody you think would be interested. That would help spread the word about the show. And yeah, I'll be putting future question boxes up on my Instagram. Usually I do it every week or every 2 weeks, and then I'll be tackling those questions in future episodes. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll chat with you next time.